Alrighty, happy Friday, everyone. Welcome to our talk today. We are going to get started in just a second. We're going to show you a quick video.
Hello everyone and welcome to today's session. We are PreMed CC, a student-led organization established in the fall of 2021. Our goal as an organization was to create an online community for pre-medical students at community colleges and universities with the hope of guiding the next generation of diverse and inclusive physicians.
And while we advertise our organization as being for community college students, our events are open to anyone. We realize that finding guidance and mentorship in a pre-med journey can be especially challenging for first-generation pre-med students, people that lack the financial resources, or just those that do not know people in the medical field.
One of the best parts about our events is that they're virtual, so you can do it from the comfort of your own home. We typically have events on Fridays from 5 p.m. to 6 p.m. PST, and on Saturdays from 10 a.m. to 11:30 a.m. PST.
If you aren't able to attend the event, all our sessions are uploaded on our YouTube channel. Many of our sessions will end with Q&A with our speakers. Any questions that you have can be put in the Q&A section on Zoom, and our team members will read them and have them answered.
After you have attended our event, you can log on to our website and complete the quiz, which will contain questions pertaining to our session today.
If you score 70% or higher on the quiz, you'll be awarded a 2-hour mentorship certificate to show that you attended our session today.
If you want to stay connected with our upcoming events or want to tell your pre-med friends about PreMed CC, you can find us on Facebook, YouTube, Instagram, and TikTok at PreMed CC.
Hello everyone, welcome to today's session. All right, let me just introduce our speaker real quick and we can get started. As the Director of MCAT for MedSchoolCoach, Dr. Ken Tao has emerged as a prominent figure in the realm of medical test preparation. His profound academic journey started at the University of California, Berkeley, where he dual majored, securing a Bachelor of Science in Bioengineering and a Bachelor of Arts in Molecular and Cell Biology. He also earned the Jeffrey A. Weiner Memorial Prize, an esteemed accolade given to the top graduating senior in the neurobiology, emphasis on the molecular and cell biology major. Further enriching his academic credentials, Dr. Tao acquired a PhD in neuroscience from Harvard University, with his scholarly contributions finding a place in prominent journals such as Neuron and Nature Metabolism. His reputation as an exceptional MCAT mentor is nationally recognized, given his vast experience working with thousands of undergraduate students as a graduate teaching assistant, adjunct faculty member, and MCAT instructor/tutor at the Princeton Review and MedSchoolCoach. His stellar record at the Princeton Review saw him as the only tutor certified in all subjects, one of their top-rated MCAT tutors, and a teacher trainer for their MCAT division. Dr. Tao's extensive teaching experience exceeding 10,000 hours, along with the valuable content he has written for a multitude of MCAT books and guides, underscores his dedication and proficiency. This is further evidenced by the remarkable MCAT scores his students attain, many of whom have scored 40 plus on the old exam and 520 plus on the current exam. Welcome, Dr. Tao.
Great, thank you for that introduction. Let me go ahead and jump in here with the slide deck. So today is the second of a 3-part webinar series that I've been giving for PreMed CC. If you were here last week, I talked about how to prepare for STEM courses as a community college student. And today I'm going to be talking about the MCAT, right? So the MCAT is the medical college admission test, and it's the exam that you have to take if you want to go to medical school in the US and Canada. And today's presentation is focusing more on the basics, really what is the MCAT and how should you prepare for the MCAT. Next week, we're going to talk about more details of how you, as a community college student, can perhaps start preparing for the MCAT exam. Okay, so I think enough introductions were already given for myself. Main thing is I have been helping students with MCAT exam for a very long time, and am really happy to share my knowledge and expertise with all of you here. And I'd like to try to keep this interactive if possible. So if you have any questions at any point, feel free to drop those questions in the chat and I'll try to respond to them as I see them. In terms of the plan for today, we're going to start first by just going through what is the MCAT exam, right? Many students in community college really don't know much about the MCAT exam because most students don't think about taking the MCAT until their junior or senior years, right? Now, occasionally there are some students who will take the MCAT as soon as the summer after their sophomore year, but that's really quite early for pre-med students, right? I would say most students are taking the MCAT in their junior year, senior year, or possibly even in their gap years after they've graduated. So we're going to start with that. What is the MCAT exam? And we're going to talk about what is a good MCAT score, and of course, what can you do to get a good MCAT score? And then at the end, we'll have a Q&A session where I'll be happy to answer your questions. All right, so the MCAT exam, you should know that it's got 4 sections. The first section of the exam is the chemical and physical foundations of biological systems. Given that long name, this is why we prefer the abbreviation, the ChemPhys section. It is 95 minutes long and has 59 questions. That's not short, right? One section of the exam, 95 minutes. That's already an hour, 35 minutes. You then have a 10-minute break, and then you have the second section of the exam, which is critical analysis and reasoning skills. This is the CARS section. This is the section of the exam that some students think of as being similar to the verbal reasoning section of the SAT or the reading section of the ACT. Yes and no, right? It's similar in that this section of the exam does not require any prerequisite knowledge of science content, but it's not the same in that the SAT and ACT are far easier, right? The SAT and ACT are focused much more on what did the passage say, right? Like, were you able to read the text and just go to the text and find the answer? The MCAT CARS section is more difficult because it's focused more on logic and argument construction, right? So you have to understand what constitutes a good argument, and the questions will ask about that. The third section is the biological and biochemical foundations of living systems, which we just call the biochem section. This section you take after lunch, all right? So you have 95 minutes of ChemPhys, you have a 10-minute break, you have 90 minutes of CARS, you have a 30-minute lunch break, and then you come back to the biochem section, which is another 95 minutes. Now, at this point, realize this test is pretty long, right? And you're not even done because there's a 4th section. You get another 10-minute break, and then you've got the last section of the exam, which is the psychological, social, and biological foundations of behavior. In total, you're looking at 6 hours and 15 minutes of test-taking time. And if you include the breaks, if you include the examinee agreement, if you include the tutorial, you can be expected to be at the testing center for about 7.5 hours, right? It's a long time. And honestly, this is the first major point that I want to make about the MCAT, right? Which is nobody at university, right? Whether you're at community college or at a 4-year institution, takes exams that are 7.5 hours long, right? If you have a final exam, that's maybe at most 3 hours, right? 4 hours if it's special, right? But most final exams are 3 hours. Here, you're looking at 7.5 hours. That is substantially longer than any other exam that you've probably taken. So this is something important to keep in mind because most of you will probably have difficulties, staying focused throughout this 1-hour presentation. So imagine staying focused for 7.5 hours, right? One of the things that students really need to do to get around this is to make sure that you take a lot of full-length practice exams to build up stamina so you're able to maintain focus throughout the entire duration of the exam. All right. Next, let's talk about the scoring system of the exam. So you've got 4 sections. Each section receives a score between 118 to 132. I know if you're looking at the scoring system, it's a little bit odd, right? 118 to 132. In reality, it's just a 15-point scale. So, from 118 to 132, there are 15 values, right? And this was selected intentionally by the AAMC because right in the middle of 118 to 132 is a 125. The advantage of this 125 is that if you have a student who gets an average score in all 4 sections of the exam, then they're going to get a 500. This makes it very easy for medical schools to look at an applicant and determine if their MCAT score is above average, because their score is in the 500s, or if their score is below average, meaning their score is in the 400s, right? And not surprisingly, the MCAT does follow a normal curve or a normal distribution. So you have this bell-shaped curve, which really indicates to you that most students who take the MCAT are going to be scoring around the average, around 500, right? That means very few students get very low scores and very few students get high scores, right? Now, of course, your goal in the MCAT is to get as high of a score as possible. And at some point, you'll probably start to hear numbers like, hey, if I want to go to this school, I need at least a 505. If I want to go to this school, I need a 510 or a 515, 520, and so forth, right? I'll talk a little bit more about specific scores that you might want to aim for as you're preparing for the MCAT, but that will be in the next slide. All right. Now, let's get into more of the details of the exam format. The MCAT is a complete multiple choice test, right? There's no free response, and this is different from a lot of what students are used to, because think about a lot of the classes you've taken. General chemistry, organic chemistry, physics, and such, right? In many of these classes, there's a lot of free response where when you have a physics question on the exam, you have to draw out a diagram, you have to draw all of the forces involved, you have to write out the equations, and you need to show your work, right? And in some ways, that's kind of nice because you can get partial credit even if you can't get to the correct answer, right? But that's not how the MCAT works. The MCAT does not have any free response. So because of that, with MCAT, it's all or nothing. You either get the question right or you get the question wrong. Now, a couple of additional points. Because it's multiple choice, there's a couple of things that are worth thinking about, right? Which is, are some questions worth more points than others? The answer is no. Every question is worth the same amount of points, whether it is an easy question or a hard question. Now, regarding questions, you should plan on answering every single question because there is no guessing penalty, right? So if there's no guessing penalty, you should never leave a question blank on the MCAT, because even if you don't know the answer to a question, if you guess, at least you have a 25% chance of guessing it correctly. All right, now a little bit more about this multiple choice test. I know at first some of you might be thrilled that this is multiple choice because you don't have to do any free response. But again, keep in mind what I said earlier, there is no partial credit at the same time. Now, the other thing that you want to think about is free response tests and multiple choice tests test your memory in different ways, right? A free response test is essentially asking you to freely recall information from your brain. For example, right now I can ask you, can you tell me what are the 50 states in the United States? All right, and you can probably start thinking, oh, you've got California, you've got Oregon, you've got Washington, you've got Nevada, you've got Arizona, but at some point it's going to be kind of hard to just think of all of the states from memory, from pure recall, right? The MCAT, because it's not a free response test, because it's a multiple choice test, it doesn't test your ability to freely recall information. Instead, it's a recognition test, right? And to go back to that example of identifying states in the US, the multiple choice version is essentially which of these answer choices is not one of the states in the United States. So in some ways, it's kind of nice because you don't have to reproduce the different states from memory. You only have to look at the answer choices and recognize, oh, Australia, that is not a state in the United States, right? So really pros and cons to the fact that the MCAT is a multiple choice test. Okay, now the next point I want to make, and this one is really quite important, is that MCAT has both passage-based questions and freestanding questions. This is really quite important because this is really the reason why the MCAT is the most difficult of all of the pre-health exams, right? It's more difficult than the PCAT, the DAT, and the OAT, right? And fun fact, this month is the last month that the PCAT is being offered. And essentially, the PCAT is not earning Pearson enough money, so they're retiring the exam. But honestly, if you look at a lot of pharmacy schools, there's a lot of pharmacy schools that will take anyone who can essentially breathe, which, for better or worse, might be a little cautious. But of course, here we're talking about medical schools. So when you look at all of these other pre-health exams, they only have freestanding questions. Freestanding questions are standalone questions that simply ask you, do you know this fact, right? So simply memorizing a lot of science content means you can do pretty well on most of the pre-health exams. Unfortunately, that doesn't work so well on the MCAT because while it does have freestanding questions only account for about a quarter of the exam. 3/4 or 75% of the MCAT are passage-based questions. What are passage-based questions, you might ask? Well, for the MCAT, you're going to be presented with a passage of text. This will show up on the left side of your screen, and these passages will introduce new situations and new information that you've never learned about before. And on the right side, you're going to have these passage-based questions, which in order to answer them, you have to apply your knowledge of the science content to the passage information to answer these questions. So in that sense, it's not just, hey, do you have the science content memorized? It's really, can you apply the science content in a new situation, right? And that, for a lot of students, is not very intuitive. And part of the reason is because this is how science content is often taught at the university level, right? When you learn about physics, it's often very abstract, right? This is the concept of Newton's law. This is the law of inertia. But now you have to take physics and apply it to the human body, right? If I have a person who's sitting down, why do they have to move their feet back in order to stand up, right? When you're suddenly given this odd scenario with a human standing up, suddenly a lot of students feel lost. They don't know how to apply the physics they've learned to these novel situations, right? And another reason why applying the science content to these passages is so difficult is because if you did not know, the MCAT, even though you need to take it to go to medical school, is not written by physicians. It is not written by MDs or DOs. It is not written by physicians. The MCAT, funny enough, is written by PhDs like myself, right? Now, unfortunate news is most PhDs do not know much about the MCAT exam. Most PhDs know a lot about scientific research. So that means a lot of passages on the science sections of the exam are adapted from peer-reviewed scientific journal articles. And the challenge there is, as a pre-medical student taking the exam, if you don't have basic science research experience, you're going to find it very difficult to read a lot of these passages because they're going to talk about lab techniques such as SDS page, ELISAs, Western blots, Southern blots, reverse transcription PCR, molecular cloning, right? And if you're listening to a lot of these terms and you're feeling confused already, that's the case for a lot of students, right? This is information most students don't learn in their college classes, but there is a reason for this, which is medical schools are recognizing the increasing importance of research, right? If you want to learn anything about a disease and how to treat it, you have to be able to do biomedical research. So these passages that are adapted from scientific journal articles are really encouraging students to get more involved with research. So if you, as a pre-medical student right now, at some point want to have an edge in your MCAT preparation, I'd highly consider joining a basic science research lab. Right now, you might not enjoy the experience, but the knowledge that you will gain, the scientific journal articles that you might review as part of your research experience will actually help you with these passages on the exam. All right, so that's exam format. Finally, let's talk about test dates. So the MCAT is offered in a lot of different months of the year, specifically the months of January through September, with the exception of February. For some reason, the AMC has never liked February. But that also means the MCAT is not offered in October, November, or December. This is important to keep in mind because as you're preparing for the MCAT, you do need to think about when you are going to take the MCAT. That's pretty much how you decide when you're going to start your studies, right? Most students, when they're studying for the exam, they'll study for 3 to 6 months. I would say that's the case for the average pre-medical student. They spend 3 to 6 months studying for the MCAT, and there are some students that will spend more time studying for the MCAT, right? Usually I don't recommend students to start studying for the MCAT more than a year in advance, right? Like if you're in your freshman year, you're like, oh, I want to start my MCAT prep. My answer is no. You should first focus on doing well in your college classes. But if you're thinking, okay, I want 6 months to be able to focus on my MCAT, you need to think, okay, when am I going to take the MCAT? And that means I need to start studying 6 months in advance of that test date. The other thing I'm going to mention is in terms of MCAT registration, please note that MCAT registration is one of the most painful processes when it comes to taking the MCAT. And the honest reason is that the AMC's website is not fantastic, right? What used to happen years ago when you took the MCAT was that the AMC would open MCAT registration in October, and they wouldn't tell students when registration was going to open. It was just going to open sometimes in the morning on the East Coast, right? So if you're a student in California, if you're in the West Coast, you'd have to wake up at like 5 or 6 a.m. because you don't know when registration was going to open. You pretty much just have to keep refreshing the website until suddenly the website opened. And then once it opened, there's a good chance that the website crashed because so many students are trying to register. So that, of course, is a problem because if you have too many students trying to go to a website to register at the same time, you're not going to be able to register, especially if the website crashes. So the AMC came up with 2 new strategies to help with this. Number one, they split registration into 2 days, right? Which is if you're on the East Coast, you might register on October 25th. If you're on the West Coast, you would wait until October 26th. It sounds like it would work well, right? But the problem is a lot of students divided by 2 is still a lot of students, right? So the website still often crashes. The other thing that they introduced was a queue, right? To try to reduce the likelihood that the website would crash, right? If you have a queue, that means the first few students who get onto the website are going to be able to register. Everyone else is in this waiting room, waiting to be able to register. Well, the way that queue works is when registration opens, if you were sitting there refreshing the page and it suddenly opens, you might be position 200 or 300 in the waiting list. And that's not too bad. You maybe wait 10, 15 minutes and you're good to go. If you weren't paying attention to when registration was going to open, and let's say it's an hour later, you might log into the AMC website, try to register for the MCAT, and find that you're position 3,000. And you're like, wow, I have to wait for 3,000 students to register before I can register. And it turns out then you have to wait a long time. You might have to sit there for an hour and a half until it's time for you to register. And that's only waiting an hour. If you had classes in the morning and couldn't get onto your computer until several hours, you might be positioned 6,000, 7,000, or 8,000, and then you're waiting multiple hours to register, right? And what makes things worse is you might be thinking, okay, if there's a whole bunch of people, why don't I just wait until tomorrow? Well, if you wait until tomorrow to register, you might find that, hey, I am in San Diego, California. I'm trying to find a testing center in San Diego, right? And I look at the website and hey, the only testing center that's available is Tennessee. And you're thinking, well, I'm not going to fly to Tennessee to take the MCAT, but I'm just sort of describing to you how the MCAT registration process works for a lot of students, right? The AMC has left a lot of for us to want in terms of improvements in terms of MCAT registration. But the main thing I'm going to tell you now is make sure you register early, right? Know when registration opens. Get on your computer at least 30 minutes to an hour before registration opens. Constantly check the website. The instant registration opens, register, be done, so you don't have to worry about getting the test date and testing center that you want. All right, so that was an overview of the MCAT exam, and hopefully that gives all of you the same baseline as to what the MCAT exam is about. I next want to talk about what is a good MCAT score. And this is something that constantly changes over time. The unfortunate news is that it usually changes in a not so good way, as in when you look at the percentiles, it's the standard bell curve, right? This is from the most recent testing data from the AMC, where the mean is a 501.3. Hasn't changed too much, right? Average is always around a 500. But you can see here, essentially, a table. This is a table of data directly from the AMC. This is table A5, if you ever want to look at the original table released from the AMC. And what it's showing you is MCAT and GPA combinations of applicants and what percentage of those applicants were accepted to allopathic or MD medical schools. Right. So first, let's be clear. This is specifically for MD medical schools, not for osteopathic or DO medical schools. This is for your MCAT score, and this is also for your cumulative GPA, right? This is not your science GPA. This is not your non-science GPA. This is your cumulative GPA. So to help us understand how this table works, let's say you're a student, you were pretty average, so you got 500 on the MCAT, and you have a 3.5 GPA. So if you look at this table, all right, 3.5 GPA, this is between 3.4 and 3.59, and a 500 MCAT score is between 498 to 501, right? You're looking at 17.6% of these applicants were accepted to medical school. Now, that's not great, right? You know, if someone told you only have a 17.6% chance of getting into a medical school, you probably wouldn't be feeling fantastic, right? But at least this is showing you how to read the table, and you can probably figure out the higher your GPA, the higher your MCAT, the higher your chances of getting accepted, right? So if you're at the top, if you've got a GPA greater than 3.79, if you've got an MCAT score greater than 517, you can see that 84.2% of these applicants were accepted to medical school. That's pretty darn good, right? But we also know, of course, that this is not everything, right? This is not 100%, which means 15.8% of these top students did not get accepted to medical school. And the reason, of course, is applying to medical school is more than just your numbers, right? Your MCAT and GPA are important, but so is your personal statement, your letters of recommendation, and all of your experiences, clinical, research, leadership, volunteer, and such, right? Now, this is a good table for you to, look at to try to get a sense of, what kind of an MCAT score you might want to aim for, right? Now, ideally, you want to aim for as high as possible, because the higher MCAT, the higher GPA, the higher your chances of getting accepted, but still giving you a sense, right? Now, one question I get from students pretty often is, if I have a high GPA, can I get away with a lower MCAT score? And I also get the opposite question, right? Which is, if I have a low GPA, can I get away with, or can I make up for that with a high MCAT score? And you can really figure that out just by looking at this table, right? So let's say you've got a really high GPA. You've got a 4.0 GPA, greater than 3.79, and you score below average on the MCAT. We say the average is 500. So, below average is maybe 494 to 497. You can see you're at 17.1%. That's not great. So the answer is, if you have a high GPA and a low MCAT, no, it does not work, right? And if you have a high GPA and a low MCAT, you should simply retake the MCAT, right? Because improving your MCAT score by just a few points makes a huge difference, right? This is a 11-point improvement, a 12% improvement, a 15% improvement, a 14% improvement, right? If you've got a high GPA, increasing your MCAT score will do wonders in terms of increasing your chances of getting accepted. So let's now think about the opposite situation. And this, for a lot of students, can be a little challenging because let's say you didn't do so hot in your college courses, right? You have an okay GPA and just you transferred and then your GPA plummeted, right? Let's say you're not happy with your GPA and let's go with a 3.1, right? If you've got a 3.1 GPA as a pre-med, that's a pretty low GPA, right? So if you've got a 3.1 GPA, but you crush the MCAT and you get a score greater than 517, you're looking at 52.6%, right? And that's pretty darn good. So the point is, indeed, if you didn't do so well in your college courses, you don't have to give up, right? You don't have to say, oh, I can't get into medical school. That's not the case, right? If you didn't do so well in your college courses, you can absolutely make up for that with a high MCAT score. But at the same time, I'm going to be honest. If you're a student who got a 3.1 GPA, chances are your academic background isn't that strong. And if your academic background isn't that strong, getting an MCAT score greater than 517 is going to be incredibly difficult.
So Dr. Tao, what if, let's say you got a 2.1 GPA? If you get, what are the chances of you getting a 528 on the MCAT?
It's tough, right? It's really quite tough. But also keep in mind, I was looking at a 3.1 GPA, right? If you're looking at a 2.1 GPA, unfortunately, that's really not going to work for medical schools. And you should probably do a post-bac to raise your GPA. But I have seen it happen before with people with low GPAs, right? People with the low threes who get a high MCAT score. But this is often for students who were quite bright, but just didn't try very hard in university. And, at least sometimes there are students who did a post-bac too, right? In their undergraduate studies, they kind of screwed around and had a lot of fun, and then later decided that they wanted to become a physician. So they did a post-bac program where they did very well, but because of their low GPA from university, their overall GPA still may be a 3.1. But because they worked really hard in their post-bac, as well as their MCAT prep, they got a fantastic MCAT score, right? So it can be done, but not easy. So hopefully you can look at this table and try to see where you are in terms of your GPA and think about what you might want to aim for in terms of your MCAT. And I can see a question here about upward trend in GPA. So I'll say this depends, right? Depends on the school, right? If you want to go to Harvard, Yale, Stanford, I would honestly say at most of those schools, it doesn't really matter, right? Because at many of these schools, the median GPA is in the 3.8s, right? 3.84, 3.85, and no upward trend in your GPA is going to bring you that high, right? But if you're looking at a lot of sort of state medical schools or not the, top elite competitive medical schools, some of these schools like UC Davis, University of Colorado, and such, if you have a good reason for your GPA and it's written in your personal statement and you really demonstrate your ability to significantly raise your GPA once you overcame those barriers and you've got, an MCAT score that matches that uptick in your GPA, many of those schools would be willing to recognize the difference. But just keep in mind, you have the data, right? If you have a 1.0 GPA, doesn't matter what your MCAT is, right? If you got 1.0 for 3 semesters and 4.0s, you can just simply see from the statistics, these students with such low GPAs aren't getting in. DO schools, which I'm not showing the data for, it's generally a little bit more forgiving if your GPA started a little bit lower, but you were able to raise it, right? And in many ways, your GPA and MCAT are trying to demonstrate to medical schools that you're able to handle the rigor of medical school courses, right? So if your GPA is really low, the medical schools have to be really worried of, is this student going to be able to graduate or not? All right. So I hope that provided some helpful context in terms of MCAT score and what you may want to do or what score you may want to aim for. Let's now talk more about preparing for the MCAT exam. So several things that you want to do. The first is to create an effective study plan, right? If you just start studying for the MCAT without a plan, you're not going to do very well, right? So you do need to have a strategy. You do need to have a plan going into your studies. And at this point, I've spoken to so many students, and there is a lot of good information out there, but there's also a lot of terrible information out there. Sometimes a student tells me, oh, I read online, this is what I should do for my MCAT prep. And I'm just thinking, what troll is writing this on the internet to try to trick pre-med students and such, right? I'll be very blunt, right? Which is, you only need to do two things to do well in the MCAT. You need to review science content and you need to do practice questions. That is literally it. You just need to review science content and you need to do practice questions and you can do well in the MCAT. But somehow I hear so many stories from students, there's a student who I spoke to and they said, oh, one of my friends told me that content review is a waste of time, that, I should just do practice exams, right? So this student, by the time I met with them, they had taken 25 practice exams and they had never scored above a 490. And here I'm thinking, how do you take 25 practice exams and never score above 490? So I asked the student, hey, what have you been doing for your studies? They're like, oh yeah, I feel like I learned really well from doing practice. My friend told me I should take a lot of practice exams. So, every Saturday I take a practice exam and then I spend the rest of the week reviewing it. And I've been doing this for over half a year now. And I'm like, yeah, I can see if you've taken so many practice exams, but the fact that that's all the student had been doing practice exams and reviewing those questions and not seeing any improvement, it's pretty obvious that practice alone is not going to get you there, right? If all you do is a lot of practice, all you're going to do is you're going to miss a lot of questions, right? The MCAT is not like the SAT. It's not like the ACT. It's not like you can just show up in test day, take the exam, and sort of use your innate knowledge to be able to do decent, right? It's true that for the MCAT exam, you want to take the prerequisite courses. So you might be thinking, oh yeah, before I take the MCAT, I need to take general chemistry, organic chemistry, physics, biology, biochemistry, psychology, and sociology. So a student might think, oh yeah, I've taken these courses before. And they take the MCAT, still doesn't work, right? So why is that the case? Well, there's so much science content on the MCAT. If all you do is practice and you don't review the science content, how are you going to learn the science content to answer the questions, right? If you don't know the science content, you can't even understand what the questions are asking you, right? And the same is true vice versa. There are a lot of students who just get stuck with content review, right? They purchase a set of MCAT books, right? Maybe from the Kaplan or the Princeton Review, and they start reading the books, and it takes them several months to read books because they're a very diligent pre-med student. They're taking very detailed notes, and after taking handwritten notes, they convert them into study guides, and then they finish reading and they feel like they've forgotten so much of the science content, and they go back and reread their books again, right? Obviously, that's not going to work out either. If you only do content review or if you only do practice, it's not going to work out. So a very simple strategy for the MCAT is simply plan to spend half of your time reviewing science content and half of your time doing practice questions. For 95% of pre-med students out there who want to do well in the MCAT, that works perfectly fine. Half of your time reviewing science content, half of your time doing practice questions. You don't have to make it more complicated than that, right? And don't try to do this trick of, oh, I want to do practice early, right? That's only going to slow you down, right? So if you want to study 6 months for MCAT, spend the first 3 months reviewing science content, then the last 3 months doing practice questions. It's not that I don't want you to do practice. It's just that if you try to do practice exams early on in your study without your content review, the practice is just a waste of time. You've wasted 7.5 hours doing a practice exam when it would be far more efficient for you to finish your content review first and then take all those practice exams that you want. All right, so again, 50-50, perfectly fine split. Now, I did say that works for about 95% of students out there, right? There's about 5% of students out there who are aiming for those higher scores, 515 plus, 520 plus on the exam. For these students, what I usually recommend is a 1/3, 2/3 split, right? So 1/3 of their time doing contra review, 2/3 of their time doing practice. But keep in mind, I'm not saying that you should be doing less contra review. The thing you need to think about is if you want a higher MCAT score, you need to put in more work and effort than the average pre-med student. All right, so remember I said earlier that if you want to study 6 months for the MCAT, that can be 3 months of contra review, 3 months of practice. That student who wants the 515 and 520 plus MCAT score is also going to do 3 months of contra review, but they're going to do 6 months of practice, right? An extra 3 months of practice. So yes, it is a 1/3, 2/3 split, but it's not because you're doing less contra review. It's because you're doing more practice. And if you really want to be thorough about this, create a study plan, right? Here's an example of a spreadsheet. You don't need to read the details, but the main thing is having a study calendar is really nice to hold you accountable to your studies. Otherwise, you just start studying. You're not really making the progress you need, and you fall behind and inevitably end up having to push back your exam. When you have a study plan mapped out such that every week, every day of your studies, you know what you're going to be doing, right? On this day, I'm going to read these chapters. On this day, I'm going to do these practice questions. On these days, I'm going to review these flashcards. Then you can make sure that you follow that schedule so you complete everything that you want to do in order to be prepared for your exam and stay on schedule. Okay, so that's a little bit about study plan. Next, I want to talk about how to use study resources effectively. There's a lot of study resources that you can use for the MCAT. There's MCAT books, there's practice exams, there are question banks, there's flashcards, there's MCAT videos, there's a whole bunch out there, right? Obviously, you know that getting a set of textbooks and using them as a paperweight on your desk is not going to get you very far, right? So the point that I'm trying to make, and I'll go through some examples here, is there's a difference between using resources and using resources effectively. And the way I want to demonstrate this is by talking about different levels of using flashcards. But keep in mind, this applies for every single MCAT resource out there. So flashcards, a lot of students will use this study aid, and it's really quite good for helping you to memorize science content. The first level of using flashcards is using pre-made flashcards. This is simply going to the store and purchasing a pre-made deck of MCAT flashcards. This is also going to MCAT subreddit, and on the MCAT subreddit, downloading some pre-made Anki decks. This is level 1, right? Now, I'd much rather have you use pre-made flashcards than not using flashcards, but keep in mind, this is the most basic level of flashcards. You have these flashcards that someone else used, you review them, they'll help you with your study. But why is this only level 1? Well, because level 2 is creating your own flashcards. When you download flashcards or purchase pre-made flashcards made by someone else, you can look at half those flashcards and be like, I have no idea what this flashcard is about, right? So if you don't understand the flashcard, what are you even memorizing in the first place? Also, keep in mind, there's a lot of studies that have been done in education about the pedagogical benefits of flashcards. And it's been determined that half the benefit of flashcards comes from creating the flashcards in the first place, right? And what is the other half? The other half is reviewing the flashcards, right? So if you use a pre-made deck, you've already lost half the advantage of flashcards. You get the memorization aspect, but you don't get the other aspect, which is incredibly helpful, which is when you create your own flashcards, it challenges you to summarize the science content in your own words. If you are able to do that, it means that you understand the science content well enough to be able to do that. If you never created your own flashcards, again, you pretty much never learned that information in the first place. You can't even explain it in your own words. You're using someone else's words for the flashcards, so you're not getting as much out of flashcards, right? So step one, using pre-made flashcards. Step two, creating your own flashcards. What's level three? It's optimizing your flashcards. And here I'll give a more concrete example, right? So here in the chat, let me throw out an example. So can someone in the chat give me the definition of positive punishment? And I know there's not that many of you in the chat, but maybe there's a psychology major here that might be able to, write for me. What is the definition of positive punishment? Well, you'd have to give me a little bit more. I can't say studying for the MCAT by itself is positive punishment. All right, I'm not seeing much in the chat, right? And it's not repeating missed cards, right? Giving a negative consequence to try and stop a behavior. So, and give an undesirable consequence after an unwanted behavior to make it less appealing. Good, right? So we have a couple of definitions here, right? So this is what I see a lot of students do, right? Which is, they have a definition for these terms, right? Give a negative consequence to try and stop a behavior. Give an undesirable consequence after an unwanted behavior to make it less appealing. And Harling's also correct, right? Adding a stimulus to reduce behavior. When you have these definitions that are as abstract as this, it doesn't get you very far, right? Why does memorizing definitions for the psych-social section not help? Well, it's because how often in the MCAT psych-social section do they ask you, what is the definition of positive punishment? Never, right? So a lot of students, when they're making flashcards for psych-social, they have a bunch of terms and a bunch of definitions. That's not how you're tested on the MCAT. The way you're tested on the MCAT, as I said before, is application, right? So let me give you a scenario. The scenario is, you have a patient, they're not feeling very well, right? So they are prescribed a medication, right? So the patient goes home, they take their medication, and it alleviates their negative symptoms, and they feel better. So who can tell me what kind of operant conditioning is that? Is that positive reinforcement? Is that negative reinforcement? Is that positive punishment, or is that negative punishment? And again, the situation is you have a patient who goes to the hospital because they're not feeling well. So they get prescribed a medication, they take their medication, and it alleviates their negative symptoms. Is that positive reinforcement, negative reinforcement, positive punishment, or negative punishment? We've got four options, 25% chance of guessing it correctly. All right, so Claudia has proposed that it is negative punishment. Melissa has proposed that it is positive punishment. Anyone else? A patient takes medication and it alleviates their symptoms. What is that? Harling says negative reinforcement. All right, we've got 3 out of the 4 now, right? And we've completed all 4, right? So if we have a guess for negative punishment, positive punishment, negative reinforcement, positive reinforcement, we're probably in trouble, right? Because obviously all 4 of you cannot be correct, but I appreciate your participation. But this is the point that I'm trying to make, right? Which is, if I look above and look at how many of you gave me the correct response as to the definition of positive punishment, there were multiple of you who gave me the correct response, right? You're adding a negative consequence or an undesirable consequence to make a behavior less appealing, to stop a behavior, to reduce a behavior. Well, then I ask about this example and we're nowhere, right? So this is the point that I'm trying to make about flashcards. If your flashcards is just term and definition, you're not going to get anywhere. If you want to make good psych-social flashcards, on one side, you need to have the term. On the back side, you need to have the definition and a concrete example, right? Because clearly, having the definition alone is not adequate for you to answer MCAT questions. So the correct answer is negative reinforcement. Why is it negative reinforcement? Well, the action is taking medication. When they take medication, you remove their symptoms. So you have taken something away. And by taking away their symptoms, you are encouraging them to continue that behavior, right? And if you're encouraging that behavior, it is reinforcement. Okay. So again, thank you all for your participation. But the main point I'm trying to make is if you're making social flashcards, it cannot just be a term and definition. It needs to be a term, definition, and example. So finally, level 4, proven review strategies. So for most students, when they're studying for the MCAT, they're going to end up with a lot of flashcards, right? And when I say a lot of flashcards, I mean a lot of flashcards, right? It is quite common for students studying for the MCAT to have 2,000, 3,000, 4,000, or even 5,000 flashcards. That's a lot of flashcards. If you're someone who likes physical flashcards, realize that's not going to work very well because 5,000 flashcards is like a mountain of flashcards. And the problem with a mountain of flashcards is you're never going to be able to keep track of which flashcards have you memorized and which flashcards do you not have memorized, right? How are you going to figure out which flashcards you need to review? This is the reason why a lot of students and medical students like to use Anki. Anki is a software that includes what is called a spaced repetition algorithm. The way the spaced repetition algorithm works is that for flashcards that you review that you know well, it's going to say, great, you know this card well, you don't have to review this card for another 2 weeks. Whereas if you say, oh, I don't know this card very well, Anki will say, okay, you need to review this card soon. You need to review this card tomorrow, right? So by using spaced repetition algorithm with something like Anki, you're going to be able to spend more time reviewing the Anki cards that you don't have memorized and less time reviewing the Anki cards that you do have memorized. And the one thing I'll say that's a little unfortunate is if you right now want to Google and look up what Anki is, it's ANKI, right? Anki, ANKI. You're going to download Anki and realize that this looks like it was made in the 1990s, and pretty much because it was made in the 1990s, right? So it's not the prettiest of software, but keep in mind it gets the job done, right? So I hope I've made it clear how something as simple as flashcards, you can use flashcards, but it doesn't mean you're necessarily using flashcards well. This concept applies to every MCAT resource. I'm not going to go through examples of each, but just realize using an MCAT resource is not the same thing as using an MCAT resource effectively. Next, be prepared to review the science content over and over again. When you're studying for the MCAT, you cannot just expect to review the science content once, have it memorized, and be ready to move on. That's not how it works, right? Simple example, amino acids, which is probably one of the highest yield concepts in the Chem Phys and Biochem section of the exam. If you spend one weekend reviewing your amino acid, you can say, great, today is Friday, I have memorized my amino acids. Well, I guarantee you a week later, you're probably going to forget most of that, right? And that's just how learning works, right? You can't retain all of the information permanently in your brain. You're going to forget some of that information. So you'll review your amino acids today. A week later, you're going to have to review it again. A month later, you're going to have to review it again. 2 months later, you're going to have to review it again. be prepared to review the science content over and over again. And on the right-hand side here, you can actually see what is called the MCAT Basics podcast, right? If any of you like podcasts, just go on the podcast app on iOS devices, or go on Spotify, Stitcher, any other app you can use on Android devices. And if you look up MCAT, the MCAT Basics podcast is pretty much always the first podcast that shows up. This podcast was created by a pre-medical student who realized that the best way for them to study for the MCAT was to create a podcast on the highest yield science concepts on the exam. And these podcasts are nice because if you are commuting to work, if you're doing chores, if you're at the gym, you can simply just play the podcast, right? It's not like you're necessarily, paying attention, close attention the whole time, but simply by having this audio podcast play in your ears, and you can just put them on repeat. Eventually, it goes in your brain, and you can almost just recite the podcast from memory, right? So just a handy strategy for some of you who want to try to find more time in your day to review science content. Check out this podcast. All right. Next point I want to make is practice like a 99th percentile student, right? In many ways, this is similar to what I said before, which is there's practice and then there's also effective practice. When I say a 99th percentile student, this is a student who gets a phenomenal MCAT score, right? These students, when they do practice as if it's the real deal, right? I can't tell you how many students, when they're doing practice, they're like, okay, I know the MCAT's at 8 a.m., but I just woke up and it's already noon. So they're like, all right, time for me to start my practice exam. But the thing is, you have to realize that if you only ever take the MCAT at noon, your brain is never going to be ready to do practice questions at 8 a.m. So you take practice exams at noon and you're like, oh, fantastic, I'm feeling really good, right? But then on test day at 8 a.m., you're taking your exam and you realize, wow, I have a really big headache, right? And of course, it's not a surprise because you were not studying and preparing for the MCAT at the same time that you're going to be doing practice, right? And there is a concept that I'm currently blanking on in my mind, right? What is that term called? There's this term that you actually need to know from the psych-soc section, which means, it's someone who's been doing this for a long time that should really know what this term is. It has to do with recall, but I can't seem to. Let me see real quick. Maybe I'll think of it at some point. Essentially, I can't think of it now, but it's not conditioning, but it's the idea that if you want to recall information, it works better if the context and your state are the same, right? So the example that's often given is if you're studying for your college exam, the best place to study for your college exam is the classroom where you're going to be taking the MCAT. Because when you're recalling the information will be easier to recall if you are in the same environment as when the information was being encoded. And I just remember the term. The term is called the encoding specificity principle, right? So the encoding specificity principle states that your ability to recall information is going to be better if the context and environment is the same or more similar to the environment when that information was encoded in the first place, right? So that's why I'm saying if you're studying for a college exam in your bed, that's going to make it more difficult to recall the information when you're taking the exam in the classroom because you're obviously not in your bed, you're not in the same environment. But realize that applies not only for the context and environment, that also applies for your state, right? So when you're studying for the MCAT, if you're always drinking coffee, right? So your brain is used to being on coffee. When you're studying, when you go take the exam, if you decide, okay, this is the MCAT, I shouldn't drink coffee, again, because you have a different mental state, you're not going to be able to recall the information as well. So that's the point I'm trying to make, right? Which is, if your brain is not used to being on until noon, then when you take the MCAT at 8 a.m., encoding specificity principle means you're not going to do so well on the exam. So practice like a 99th percentile MCAT student. Start your practice at 8 a.m., follow all of the breaks, and if you want to be even better, figure out what you're going to be eating for lunch on test day, and for every single one of your practice exams, get used to eating that same meal. So that way nothing throws you off, right? Sometimes students tell me, oh, I made a bad choice. For my lunch, I decided to have mac and cheese or something. And then in the Bao Chem section, I had food come out and I was just so tired and couldn't maintain focus. There's so many things that you can do to prevent these things, which is simply practice like a 99th percentile MCAT student. Do practice the same way you're planning on taking the MCAT on test day. All right. And just as important is really reviewing practice exams. This is something that students know to do, but as I have been saying this entire presentation, there's a difference between reviewing practice exams and reviewing practice exams effectively. And the reason why I say this is because there are a lot of pre-medical students that will take a lot of MCAT practice exams and their scores won't improve. And they'll reach out to me and say, hey, I keep taking practice exams, but I feel stuck, right? Like I'm at this plateau of a 505 and I can't seem to score above that. I'm always very honest to the student. If your score is not improving, it means you're not adequately reviewing your practice exams, and that's because you are making the same mistake over and over again. That's the only way your score doesn't improve, right? Because if you're reviewing the questions properly, if you're learning from your mistakes, you aren't making the same mistakes, so your scores should improve. So the only way your score is not improving is because you're not doing the review of your practice exams correctly. Of course, you wonder, how do I properly review practice exams? You ask yourself 3 questions. Why did I get this question wrong? How do I get this type of question right next time? And if I missed the question because I was lacking content knowledge, what content knowledge was I lacking? You ask yourself these 3 questions, and these 3 questions are crucial to understand why you made this mistake, so that way you don't make the same mistake again. Now, I know this sounds obvious. Many of you are saying, of course, that makes sense. And yes, it does make sense. I'm glad you agree. But it's easier said than done. So take a look at an example question. And it's a multiple choice question. It's an MCAT style question. It's a physics question too, if you need that context. So I would like all of you to take a look at this question, read it over, and in the chat, select the answer that you think is correct, right? And remember, you're supposed to pay attention, right? You have to pay attention to pass this quiz. So there's no reason why I'm not seeing all of you respond in the chat. And remember, if you treat this like the MCAT, there is no guessing penalty. So if you don't guess, that means you're actually losing points here. All right, give this a try and we'll go over this soon. I was going to say, we're going to be in trouble if our first 4 answer choices were A, B, C, and D. All right. So we have a decent number of responses. And again, I appreciate the participation. Lets me know that you are perhaps still listening to what I'm saying. And we can see that it seems like C has won, right? The most of you think the answer is C, and we've got a couple A's and B's here, right? So nice job to the two of you who picked A. So nice job to Sarah and Benjamin. Now, for a lot of students, when they see this question, when they get it wrong, they often just go to the solutions, right? So let me show you what the solutions that you'll often see for an MCAT practice question, what it will look like. The question will often say, oh, the power of a lens is given by P equals 1 over F, and that will yield P equals 1 over 2 centimeters equals negative 50 diopters. This is what you often see as the solution to an MCAT question. And a lot of students like, oh, I get it. The reason why I missed this question is because I didn't know the power equation. And I see, got it, 1 over 2 negative 50. Great. It's not so easy, right? So number one, it's kind of unfortunate that MCAT solutions often aren't very good. Number two is students thinking that if they read the solution, they now understand the question. I want to break down this question step by step, what you needed to be able to do to answer this question correctly. Number one, recognize this question is asking about optics, right? They're talking about lenses. They mentioned diverging lens. Number two, recognize what specifically they're asking about lenses. They're asking about the power of lenses, right? Number three, yes, you do need to be able to recall the power equation. Power is equal to 1 over focal length. Number four, you have to remember that while focal length is almost always given in centimeters, the units for power is a diopter, which is a 1 over meter. So that means you need to convert the 2 centimeters to 0.02 meters. Number five, you need to actually be able to do the math. Are you able to calculate 1 over 0.02? And number six, do you remember that diverging optics have a negative focal length? All right, there are really 6 different steps in order to answer this question correctly. And chances are you might have missed multiple of these steps. Whichever of those steps that you missed, that's what you need to identify as to why you missed this question, right? So I would say, for a lot of students, they might say, oh, I knew the power equation, I knew it was 1 over focal length, but essentially it would be, oh, I forgot the sign of the focal length for diverging lenses, right? And something else might be, oh, I forgot that a diopter is 1 over meters, right? And how do I get this type of question right in future? Well, again, it depends on why the student missed this question. In this case, it is simply review optics. It's a content gap. They need to review this. So what is the content knowledge they were lacking? Well, it's probably that converging lenses / mirrors, they have a focal length that's positive, and diverging lenses / mirrors, the focal length is negative. And keep in mind that while focal length is almost always given in centimeters, it must be converted to meters to calculate power in diopters, which is 1 over meter. So this is an example of how one student might answer these 3 questions, but keep in mind, all of this is highly specific to each student, right? Why you specifically missed the question, because I'll tell you, there are other students who actually understand the physics. They knew the equation, they knew this was optics, they knew the focal length was negative, but they missed the question because it was a math error, right? The math error was they solved 1 over 50 incorrectly. right, did not know how to calculate 1 over 50. And this is not trivial, right? Sorry, 1 over 0.02. This is not trivial. For a lot of students, the math is what prevents them from scoring well. So what do they need to do? How can they get this question right next time? I mean, probably math practice, but also more important, I would say, is develop a strategy for decimals with fractions, right? Because if this is a student who, has difficulties dealing with decimals with fractions, they need some strategy. Otherwise, the next time they see decimals with fractions, they're going to get this question wrong. So what is that strategy they might do? They might say something like, when dealing with decimals in fractions, multiply by 10 over 10 until the decimals are gone, right? Coming up with a strategy like this because, hey, they don't know how to calculate 1 over 0.02. If you don't want to make the same mistake, how are you going to fix that problem? Well, this student just said, all right, if I've got 1 over 0.02, if I don't know how to deal with the decimals, I wrote here, my strategy is I'm going to multiply by 10 over 10 until I get rid of the decimals. All right, so I multiply by 10 over 10, that gives me 10 over 0.2. I still have a decimal, so I'm going to multiply this again by 10 over 10. That gives me 100 over 2, and hey, I can calculate this. This is 50, right? So my point is, reviewing questions is not the same for every student. The reason why you missed this question is not the same reason why another student missed the same question. You need to be honest with yourself and reflect on why you missed this question and how can you get this question right next time. So I hope that was helpful, and it's really what I have for this evening. So of course, I hope that presentation was helpful and happy to take questions.
You guys, this is your chance to ask any questions you have. So put them in the Q&A. Dr. Tao is an expert at MCAT, so take advantage of this opportunity.
You are not allowed calculators, correct? So that is correct. You are not allowed to use a calculator in the MCAT, so you are expected to be able to do some amount of math. That includes addition, subtraction, multiplication, division, scientific notation, logarithms, fractions, right? I would say that's about the extent of math on the exam. There's no calculus, right? But there are no calculators on the exam. Would it look bad if we take the MCAT more than once? So the best MCAT score is 1 MCAT score, right? So the fewer times you take the MCAT, the better it is, right? It doesn't mean that you can't retake the MCAT. Half of all pre-med students retake the MCAT, right? So if half of all pre-med students retake the MCAT, then obviously there's a lot of students who retake the MCAT. But if you retake the MCAT, it should be for a good reason, right? You can't just say, oh, it's okay for me to take the MCAT multiple times. Let me just go take the exam for fun, see what it's like. That's not good because that's wasting an attempt, right? So when it comes to the MCAT, my recommendation for students is don't plan for failure, right? You're not going to take this exam just so you can take it again, right? That is a waste of your time, and that's going to hurt your medical school application, right? Take the MCAT when you are ready to take the MCAT. Now, if for some reason you don't do as well as you want, or you want to aim for a higher score, no problem. You can retake the MCAT. But that should not be your plan going in. It shouldn't be, oh, I already put in so much time and effort to studying for the MCAT. I'm just going to take it and see what happens. Not a good strategy. Take the MCAT only when you're ready. All right. What review books do you recommend for content? there's a lot of options out there, right? Kaplan, Princeton Review, Exam Crackers, Blueprint. It honestly doesn't matter what set of books you've used, right? There are plenty of students who have used every set of books out there, and students using each set of those books and have gotten great MCAT scores. But I will say there are many more students who have used each set of books out there and gotten terrible MCAT scores. So the point isn't so much about which set of books you use, it's more so how you use the books, right? But any set of MCAT books from one of the big companies works just fine. All right, next question. For a daily routine, how do you recommend we go about planning our review of specific course material? Do you have a recommended resource for creating this plan for ourselves? So for the MCAT, it's honestly not that difficult. As I said, you need two things. You need content review and you need practice, right? So, the average pre-med student might pick up a set of MCAT books, right? And purchase the AMC questions. What should you do? Well, take a look at your Kaplan books, figure out how many chapters there are, or pick up your Princeton Review books, count how many total chapters there are, right? If you're using Kaplan, you're going to see, oh, all right, there's a total of 72 chapters I need to read. I need to finish my content review in 2 months. All right, so I've got 72 chapters in about 8 weeks, right? That means every week I need to read 9 chapters, right? So as easy as that, 72 chapters divided by 8 gives me 9. So you might just say, okay, I can do that if I read a chapter, 1 chapter for every weekday, that's 5 chapters, and 2 chapters each on Saturday and Sunday. That's 9 chapters. There you go, 9 chapters a day, 8 weeks, you finish your content review. Practice doesn't have to be that complicated either. Look at the AMC questions, you can add up the total number of questions. Okay, I've got 2,600 practice questions, and again, I've got 2 months, I've got 8 weeks. All right, 2,600 divided by 8, the math isn't as simple, right? But you'll get something along the lines of 36 questions, right? So you're like, okay, 36 questions a day. That already tells you, okay, on average, I need to complete about 36 questions per day in order for me to finish all of the practice that I want by test day. Now, keep in mind, none of this has to be perfectly strict, right? I'm not saying, oh, you have to read a chapter Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday, and 2 chapters on Saturday and Sunday. Life happens, right? So when you're building a study plan, it's often helpful to have some, buffer time built in. Or just some days off, so you don't feel like you're going to go crazy while studying for MCAT. But all of these things you can plan for, right? Just figure out what exactly it is that you need to do in terms of the amount of practice and chapters you want to read, spread them out over your study plan, and you're good to go. All right. How is Khan Academy for content review? Khan Academy is a pretty good source for content review. But the thing you have to realize is that Khan Academy is not comprehensive. As in, you can watch all of the Khan Academy videos, start doing some practice questions, and realize there's a lot of science content that Khan Academy didn't teach me, right? And that's just how it works. Khan Academy is not comprehensive. So MCAT videos are a nice supplemental resource, but you cannot use them as your primary source of content review. And I know a lot of you might be saying, well, the reason why I like MCAT videos is because they're easier than MCAT books, right? Like when I read a book, I feel like I'm not learning anything, or the books are just, so tough to read. Well, I'm going to tell you the truth. Getting an MCAT score is not easy. And if you're not willing to put in the work to read a set of MCAT books, you're not going to get a top MCAT score, right? So if you're not willing to put in that much effort into your MCAT studies, you're going to get the same MCAT score as students who don't put in a lot of effort. But again, going back to Khan Academy, it's a great supplemental resource, but MCAT books should be your primary source for content review. All right. And I see a question that is about accommodations on the MCAT. So there are students out there who require accommodations in, Let me first turn this off. All right, let's talk about accommodations. There are some students who require accommodations in order to take the MCAT exam, and this can be for a variety of reasons, right? This is typically for students with diagnosed learning disabilities. And depending on what their learning disability is, they may receive different accommodations from the AAMC. And this is not to let them cheat. This is essentially to level the playing field because of the learning disabilities that they have. So some of these students might get extra time to take the MCAT. They might have time and a quarter, time and a half, or double time. Some students might also have what are called stop the clock breaks, right? Now remember what I said before, which is the MCAT has 4 sections. You get a 10-minute break between the Chem Phys section, a 30-minute lunch break between Cards and Bio Chem, and another 10-minute break between the Bio Chem and Psych-Soc sections. Normally, you have to finish each section before you can go on break. But for some students, for example, those students with testing anxiety, they can't wait until that break to go on break. So these students who have stop the clock breaks, they have a special button on their screen that allows them to go on break at any point during the exam. This can also be for other reasons. For example, I had a student who had a digestive disorder. And because of the digestive disorder, the student had to use the bathroom more frequently and often without much advance notice. So this student was also able to receive stop the clock breaks for that reason. There's some students who their arithmetic skills are so weak that they're permitted to use a calculator on the exam. It's not a scientific calculator. It's not a graphic calculator, just for us. Addition, subtraction, multiplication, division. There's some students who also get to take the exam in a quiet environment. I also had a student who got in a car accident recently, and they couldn't sit for very long because of damage to their spine. So they were allowed to use a standing desk while they take the MCAT. Essentially, there's a variety of different accommodations that a student can receive, either for learning disabilities or for medical reasons. The process for applying for accommodations, I'm going to tell you, unfortunately, is very tedious. There's a very long application, and it needs to start first with a medical diagnosis, right? You need to go to a physician who is going to diagnose the reason why you need accommodations, right? So if it's for a learning disability, it's usually with a learning specialist who is a physician and is familiar with, maybe testing anxiety. Maybe they're familiar with your ADHD. Maybe they're familiar with your dyslexia, right? They can actually diagnose it because it's the physician who in the application writes in which accommodations they think that you need in order to take the MCAT, right? That's the first step. There's also a whole bunch more, which is you have to write a personal statement. You have to write an essay explaining your accommodations and the reason why you need accommodations. You need to submit a lot of paperwork. And what I'll say is, in terms of paperwork, the longer the paper trail, the higher your chances of getting approved for accommodations. If you're a student who did well in high school, you got a really high GPA, you went to college, and you're doing pretty well in your classes, and then in your senior year, you got diagnosed with ADHD, and then you're taking the MCAT. It's unlikely the AMC is going to approve that accommodation because they're going to say, clearly, you're able to get good grades despite your ADHD, right? So why are you suddenly now trying to get extra time with the MCAT, right? So the paper trail, this is for students who have been receiving accommodations for an extended period of their lives. There are students who were diagnosed with a learning disability in elementary school. So ever since elementary school, middle school, high school, and college, they've continuously received accommodations for all of their exams and standardized tests that they took. So if you have a long paper trail, you have a high chance of getting approved for accommodations. If your paper trail is shorter, it's going to be more difficult unless it's some kind of a medical reason. For example, you just got in a car accident or something like that. So I hope that provides some clarity on accommodations. Also keep in mind, the process for applying for accommodations takes a long time, not only because of all the amount of work you have to put in to apply for accommodations, but because the AMC takes many months to review your application. And sometimes they review your application only to tell you no. And when they tell you no, it doesn't mean that you can't get off accommodations. It often means you have to appeal and go through a whole bunch of more paperwork to try to get your accommodations approved. So it's a very long process. It's a very tedious process. But if you are a student who needs these accommodations to perform your best on the MCAT, it is something that you should apply for. All right, back to the Q&A. When is the best time to take the MCAT? So you should know that the MCAT, even though there is the normal curve, right, the bell curve, you're not competing against other test takers, right? So I sometimes have students ask me, it's like, oh, when is the best month of the year to take the exam? Which in other words is just asking which test day of the year are the dumbest students taking the MCAT? So that way I can shine, right? And that's not how it works, right? There is no best time to take the MCAT. The best time to take the MCAT is when you are ready. And that's it, period, right? The best time to take the MCAT is when you are ready. Now, you do need to take into account the medical school application cycle, right? You do need to take the MCAT before you apply to medical school. So generally, you want to take the MCAT by May before you take the MCAT, because if you take the MCAT after May, if you take it in June, July, or August, then you're delaying your medical school application, which reduces your chances of getting accepted. All right. Which weighs the most after GPA and MCAT scores? Personal statement, recommendation, leadership, volunteer research. You're not going to get a straight answer from anyone, right? So if you ask any medical school admissions committees, there's no real answer, right? Medical school admissions committees love to use the word holistic, right? They look at your application holistically, and it's true. They're going to look at all of these different aspects of your application. The only part that I don't agree is when they say there is no minimum for their MCAT, right? You'll say, I got a 472 on my MCAT. Will you consider me? And they'll say, yes, we review our applications holistically. But if you take any time and look at their median MCAT scores and the MSAR, medical school admissions requirements, where they share all of the data on students who are accepted, you can tell it's clearly not that holistic, right? So the MCAT and GPA, I think, are really the only metrics where there are true sort of minimum scores that you need to hit. Otherwise, they can't seriously consider your application, right? But everything else, personal statement, letters of recommendation, leadership, volunteer research, those aren't numbers. You can't filter by numbers. You can't sort by numbers, right? So it has to be someone who's actually sitting down, reviewing your application, and they have to think about how compelling is the story that you're telling. So you can't weight those. And you also can't even say that the GPA and MCAT are more important, right, than those other aspects of your application, right? GPA and MCAT are important because if your numbers aren't high enough, your application won't be, even seriously considered in the first place. But you can't say that it's more important than the other factors in your application. All right. What is an effective way to tell that you are ready to take the MCAT? You take MCAT practice exams. And if your MCAT practice exams are at or above your target score, you can say you're probably ready to take the MCAT, right? So MCAT practice exams, very easy. Any deck recommendations for Anki? I told you earlier, create your own Anki deck. Creating your own Anki deck is way more effective than downloading a pre-made Anki deck from Reddit. How in-depth should each section of content be reviewed? Again, there's no perfect answer. As thorough as it needs, right? Some students, they might only have to review a few weeks for the MCAT, right? Like I've worked with a student, they studied 3 weeks for the MCAT and they got a 520 plus MCAT score. I've talked to other students who've studied 5 years for the MCAT and can't even break 500, right? The amount of time that you need to study for the MCAT depends on you yourself as a student. And ultimately, it boils down to hey, if I ask you, how does acid-base chemistry work? Can you explain that to me? If you can, you're good to go. If you can't, you need to do more review. So every student is different. Some students need to study more, some students need to study less, but you need to study as much as you need in order to get your target score. All right. Does the content in the exam vary slightly? I've heard some tests have 5 or 10% physics, and the majority are made up of 65% biology or biochem. It does vary, but not by that much, right? So the AMC has prescribed percentages, right? For the Chem Phys section, 30% general chemistry, 25% physics, 25% biochemistry, 15% organic chemistry, 5% biology. The issue for a lot of students is sometimes they don't know what counts as what, right? If they're talking about amino acids, it could be considered an organic chemistry question or a biochemistry question, depending on what specifically they're asking about with amino acids. With nuclear chemistry, it could be general chemistry or physics, depending on what they're asking about, right? So there is some fluctuation, but they're really quite minimal, right? It's never, the MCAT's supposed to be 25% physics, and my exam was 50% physics, right? That never happens. There's a little bit of fluctuation, but it'll be less than 5%. So quite negligible and not something you have to worry about. All right. Should students incorporate practice exams towards the end of their study or start toward the middle practice phase? I don't have a strong preference here. Just remember what I said earlier, content review first, practice later, right? So after you finish your content review, then you can start practice. Some students like to start small and build up towards practice exams. Other students like to do a practice exam every weekend once they get to practice. It's really a matter of personal preference.
All righty. Well, it's 6:33. Does anybody have any other questions? And I know there's some people had some questions last week. I don't know if they're back here, but well, gonna wait a second. I like your bookshelf, by the way.
I do like it too. It's very much not real.
I would think you would have more books in it than vases.
Yes, and also the light might be facing, the same direction as the light is hitting my face, but not quite.
Well, at least where you at now has more sunlight than when you were before, right?
Much more than Boston, that's for sure.
All right, there's one more question.
Sure. What is the style of the MCAT? I feel like I spent a lot of time talking about this today. You said, I know for the SAT, you have to be good at taking the standardized test style. The MCAT is similar. The MCAT is a standardized test, and test taking skills are important, right? There have been studies done to see how well do students' MCAT scores correlate with how successful they are as physicians. There is no correlation, right? The only thing that the MCAT correlates with in medical school is how well you do on your board exams, right? Which you can really just think of as test taking skills. But that's also important for medical schools, because if you have a student who doesn't have those test taking skills, then they have trouble passing those exams, and those medical schools have difficulties trying to figure out how to get those students to graduate. Do you recommend MCAT tutors to study? What role do you think they play in the study process? So I work for a company called MedSchoolCoach, which very much helps students prepare for the MCAT with one-on-one MCAT tutoring. The way I usually think about it is you can prepare for the MCAT by yourself, or you can prepare for the MCAT with an MCAT expert, right? And when you look at that difference, certainly working with an MCAT expert is advantageous, right? Here is someone who really knows the MCAT exam, knows what you have to do to be able to succeed, someone who can build a personalized study plan for you. And as you're reviewing science content and practice questions, if you have questions about, hey, I don't understand the science content, or I had a tough time in this passage, here's an MCAT expert who can answer all of those questions for you and teach you the strategies that you need to elevate your score, right? So getting help on the MCAT certainly helps, but you also have to realize that at the same time, it comes at a substantial cost, right? So it's not cheap to work with MCAT experts, but they certainly can help students with their MCAT preparation.
All righty. Well, I think I've held you longer than I'm supposed to, and I don't want to get in trouble with your boss.
Not today, but maybe next week.
She working tonight?
She is. So thankfully, I'm not going to be back until around 8 p.m. So I can stay longer if needed, but I have a feeling the students might have had enough MCAT for the night.
All right. Well, I'm at work, so I could, if I wasn't at work, we could have sat and chatted till late. But anyways, I have to run too. So it was really good seeing you. Thank you for coming.